the notion that our racism is better than theirs suggests that there's a good kind of racism, and there isn't.
Gary, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
No, big honor, big pleasure. Now, I know you had the dreaded Rona recently, so you're now you're recovered.
I'm back to the same ill health I was before I had coronavirus. Yes.
Well, that's good to know. The old Gary, whatever, is back. Let's go straight into it. So we've just had this attempted far right insurrection in the United States in the Capitol, and it's interesting. 2021 starts just so we know that 2020 wasn't. We had this roller coaster. 2021 is like, no. If you think things are going to calm down, good luck. Now, a lot of commentary is kind of in the US in particular has kind of focused on it being a kind of aberration, un-American even. What do you think about
that? Sadly, I think it is. I mean, it's very rare. Obviously, this particular thing that last time was in early 19th century, and it was the Brits. So the particular thing of storming the Capitol, of course, is very, very rare. But America was built on, among other things, slavery and genocide. The notion of a group of violent, almost exclusively white and overwhelmingly male people attacking a choice that they don't like. That in itself is not rare. And in fact, the seeds for this were planted long ago and have been growing. And anyone with eyes to see, particularly, but not exclusively in the last 4 years, Trump has been inciting violence throughout that time, sometimes literally calling on his supporters to beat up hecklers. For example, calling the people at Charlottesville fang people, the neo-Nazis, not the anti-fascists, that this is... I saw Van Jones on CNN say, is this the start of something or is it the beginning of something? And actually it's a continuation of something. This logic has been going on for a while. And there is a kind of symmetry, I would say, in the fact that the day before there was an election in Georgia. The night before, Georgia elected its first black senator. There were 2 Senate elections. Georgia elected its first black senator, Raphael Warnock. The next morning came the insurrection, the mob, and shortly after, Trump says, I love you, you're beautiful people, but please come home, please go home. We see that the other Georgia Senate seat has gone to the first Jewish senator ever in Georgia. Both of those Senate seats, Georgia has had a 24% increase in minorities in the last 20 years. Both of those Senate seats won by quite narrow majorities with a very mobilized black vote and diverse, the more diverse suburbs coming out in significant number. And so you see, while those 2 things, the mob, insurrection, and the election are separate, what you see with that result in the heart of the Confederacy is the world that these people fear, a world where they are no longer necessarily as dominant as they were. Still dominant, but no longer as dominant as they were. And ultimately, I think that is what this insurrection is about. When they say they stole the election from us, the they speaks to the people that they don't really count as being American, just like they didn't count Obama as being American. Their world, the world of the white supremacist man, has been ebbing away, and they are in. When democracy stops working for them, they'll support democracy when it works for them. When it stops working for them, they can do without it. And so unable to cohere a coalition that can win at the ballot box, they then go to the Capitol and in ways that are very, very serious and somewhat tragicomic, decide that they will storm it by force.
Now, you actually spoke to some of these right-wing extremists in the United States in Angry White and American, which people should watch if they can, including Richard Spencer, who is a white supremacist and a neo-Nazi. I mean, when you saw that mob, that insurrection in the Capitol, how did it, when you look back at those interviews that you did, including with Richard Spencer, what did you think? Because that must have come back.
Yeah, I mean, I reported from America for The Guardian for 12 years, and these people are very familiar to me. You know, I remember interviewing a guy in Colorado, because in a way you have the cartoonish people like Richard Spencer, who is a kind of, you know, plays the gentleman Nazi, the kind of, you know, abdicated Edward kind of character. But just regular people, you'd be doing a vox pop. There was one vox pop I was doing in Colorado, and I asked the guy, so has Obama done anything that you think is good? And he said, well, he's been good for ammunition sales, you know, because my friends are stockpiling. That when I did my book, Another Day in the Death of America, one of the things I learned, it's about all of the kids that are shot dead in one day, is that the number of people who own guns in America is going down and the number of guns is going up quite substantially. So you have this increasingly armed, increasingly enraged populace, and that with white people, I think will be a minority in America by about 2045. And so this whole, it's been a theme. It's been a while. The Tea Party, the kind of Republicans shutting down the Congress, or you know, and threatening to several times, and then Trump. They are kind of a piece. These conspiracy theories, even, which are kind of get ever more bizarre, but they're not new. The Clintons, they say, the conspiracy theories, assassinated 50 close associates and ran a drug for arms trade through Arkansas. Why anyone would do that through Arkansas is beyond me. They, in 2010, more than half of Republicans thought that Obama was a Muslim or a terrorist who wanted the terrorists to win. I mean, so this has been going on for a while, and I don't think that this will break the fever. I don't think this is the end of it. I think, in fact, it's the beginning of something else. But I also think we have to be careful about understanding what it was. I mean, both of us are in Britain. So you saw it on telly like I do. I mean, you saw it. What did you, people called lots of things, demonstrators, protesters, insurrectionists, domestic terrorists, that it was a coup d'etat. What did you see?
Yeah, I mean, the intention, I think, was an attempted coup, wasn't it? It was a far-right coup. It was very clear there were neo-Nazis present, and an American journalist did a thread where he went through many of those involved, looked at their tattoos, the images using, including someone, of course, with a T-shirt referring to Auschwitz. I mean, a lot of them were clearly Nazis who stormed the Capitol, some with the intention, whatever, you know, I mean, in a sense, it's almost kind of like whatever the means that they actually had at their disposal to complete the task that they saw, the intention for many of those present was an insurrection and a coup d'etat to overturn the elections and to install, for the next few years, a candidate who had lost fair and square.
See, because I think it was definitely an erection. It was a violent, you know, attack on the government. To the extent it was a coup, it was a pretty bad one. I mean, it seemed to me that they broke into the Capitol totally with the intention. I mean, the date and everything else was about preventing certification or interrupting certification, certainly. And the fact that both Donald Trump and Giuliani are on the phone while it's taking place, trying to lobby different Congress people in Congress, suggests that they saw it as a moment of leverage. But then when you look at what they do when they get in there, they take selfies, they kind of grab mementos, they kind of pose provocatively, they strut. It was also kind of, to me, an exercise in kind of a very aggressive form of futility. I mean, one of the most worrying things for me is the role of the police in this, and the fact that, I mean, when it comes to a coup, you can have the active switching of allegiance of the state, or you can have, and it's often the case, just a kind of ambivalence and an indifference. And we know that there were several off-duty officers, many of whom have been put on leave, who were in the mob. There was a deliberate, it seems, attempt not to police it properly. And I kind of like, well, I mean, the handful of police that remained there tried to fight them off, but that was never going to happen. And the fact that that couldn't happen with Black Lives Matter protesters or Antifa or even the Women's March is a matter of politics. It's because the police, in a year when we've seen Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter and a challenge to the way in which the country is policed, a significant section of the police looked at them and did not see a threat, which to me suggests a question mark over the reliability of the allegiance of the police when faced with white supremacist domestic terrorists attacking the kind of citadels of symbolic citadels of democracy. And that to me was in some ways, the most scary thing was how it happened rather than that it happened.
I mean, what do you think now happens to Trumpism? I mean, again, there was a standard narrative amongst, I suppose, lots of centrists, liberals, never Trumpers, that Trump kind of landed from a clear blue sky. What is this? And idyllic America has been disturbed by this sudden aberration. So what do you think? I mean, in terms of you put it in context of continuity, but what is Trumpism now? Where do you think it goes from here? Is there going to be an escalation? And you made that point. Was that a beginning or an end? Was it a conclusion or a prologue? I mean, what do you think? What do you think this marks now? What will Trumpism do? How will it relate to Trump, in the coming years?
Well, they are emboldened. His people are emboldened, and that kind of Trump is the product of American racism and kind of xenophobia and right-wing nationalism rather than the originator of it. And these people have a habit. I mean, they're always there. Every now and then they coalesce. Sometimes they coalesce around a thing like healthcare. Sometimes they coalesce around a person, Palin, Trump, if you go back further, Strom Thurmond, George Wallace. And so I think what we're going to see in the coming years is a kind of more aggressive and more violent. There will be a kind of reconfiguration, a realignment within the Republican Party. There will be, but it's not going to be towards the Republicans, having a kind of come to Jesus moment. I mean, the people who resigned from Trump cabinet, for example, are people, who stood by him through Charlottesville, through, a range of things that he's done, and are now 2 weeks after he's lost an election, which he denied he'd lost, after a kind of, a failed mess of an insurrection, with 2 weeks to go as he's being impeached, say, here I draw the line. I mean, these are not kind of particularly principled people. These are not people you would want to go into battle with. So the realignment will be around what they think they can, what the Republicans think they can get away with. What, in effect, what this spectacle did last week was give white supremacy and extreme nationalism a bad name, and what they would prefer is a much more plausibly deniable kind of version of that. So what I think you're going to see is a much more militant and violent fringe, and a kind of, for a while, a somewhat confused and even more opportunistic than useful kind of leadership, trying to kind of work out where it can land and still keep his job, because these people have to stand in primaries, and the Republican base, Trump, the morning after Trump was on speakerphone to the Republican National Committee. They were having their winter meeting in Florida, and he came on a speakerphone and they cheered. Roughly 2/3 of the House Republicans voted not to certify the results in Pennsylvania, even though Biden got almost twice as many, twice as wide a margin in Pennsylvania vote-wise than Trump did against Hillary. And there's one more thing, I would mention, which is that, which is Biden, because to a large degree it depends what Biden does. That he's going to be inaugurated on January the 20th. The day of the mob was, at that point, the worst day in terms of coronavirus deaths. A couple of days later, the jobs report came out, and for the first time in many months, America had lost 140,000 jobs. Unemployment level at 6.7%, the first time in 7 months that it hadn't got better. The police or the FBI are predicting more insurrections in the run-up to Biden's inauguration, and Biden's talking unity, which is fine, depending on what basis you are seeking that unity, because the Obama years were characterized by, first of all, Obama reaching out over the aisle and finding there was no one there. Secondly, him negotiating with himself before he did anything, and therefore coming up with plans that were somewhat inadequate to the situation. And so people thinking, my life's not better, that this isn't working. I'm still poor. I was hoping, and now I'm no longer hoping. And so, and that saw the rise of the Tea Party and the massive defeat at the first midterms in 2010. So Biden has to be bold. He's not going to do what I would want someone to do, but whatever he does has to be bold given the challenges that are facing the American economy, because people will unite around some sense of their lives getting better, but they're not going to unite around a notional sense of an America that doesn't exist.
Just before I ask you about the left and Biden, I mean, a lot of people very excited that I was going to speak to you, but people are interested in the whole kind of social media, Trump, him being booted off. Obviously, some are presenting that as a freedom of speech issue. I mean, how much do you think actually his social, his presence on those social media platforms was actually quite critical to this? I mean, a lot of the people who stormed the Capitol were interviewed, basically regurgitating Donald Trump tweets. So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very important way in which he kind of managed to communicate with people. And I dare say, given time, and he doesn't have that much time left as president, he'll find another way. A bit like all the other stuff, right-wing nationalism and white supremacy predated all of these social media platforms. And so the fact that it's going to go off and be in another corner somewhere and will not have the kind of widespread the kind of contact that kind of it's had before, I think is good. It begs a lot of questions about. I mean, it's all very well being moral after the event when it doesn't cost you anything particularly, but where were these platforms and those people who run them after Charlottesville, after the shooting in the synagogue in Pittsburgh, during the Black Lives Matter protest? This is not the first time that Trump's incited violence. It's not the first time that he has distributed falsehoods. And so there is this thing where people kind of watch the way the wind is blowing and then will move it with it so long as it's blowing a gale. But in the meantime, people can do an awful lot of damage. I don't think it's a freedom of speech issue. You don't have the right. Nobody has the right to be on Twitter, and it's or Facebook or whatever. And Trump can still speak freely. Nobody owes him or his supporters necessarily a platform, and they do have the opportunity to start their own platform. There is an issue, to be honest, about the monopolies involved in these new technologies. I do think that that's an issue. I just don't think that Trump and Quanon are the best illustration of why those monopoly positions are a bad thing. But given that they've shown that they can do it, the question one has to ask, a little bit like the resignations, are why did it take you so long? And where were you when X was happening? This is not the first time. This is just the most dramatic time.
Before I ask just final two questions on Britain here, in terms of the US, you mentioned, of course, Biden. What do you think now? We saw last year Black Lives Matter, which obviously predates last year, but it became this huge force on the streets of the United States and elsewhere, which is the other thing I'll ask you about afterwards. But what role do you think those movements will play in the Biden era? BLM specifically, the left in general. We've seen the so-called squad, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez being the most famous example, but also Ilhan Omar and others, and now they've been infused with fresh blood in Congress. What role do you think those, the left, BLM will now play? I mean, do you think 2008, people often say the issue was a lot of people passively invested their hope in Obama when he became the nominee. He'll press all these buttons when he's president. We don't need to do anything. We don't need to mobilize. Do you think that'll set in again?
I think it's less likely because I think there was less euphoria and less idealism and utopianism around Biden's election than there was around Obama's. But yes, that was very much what happened with Obama, was that to some extent people expected him to organize a left opposition to himself, which is not very reasonable. And it comes back to the Roosevelt quote, I think to A. Philip Randolph, when Randolph was trying to persuade him, he was a black trade unionist, and trying to persuade him to integrate the military. And Roosevelt said, I want to do it. You must make me do it. I'm mangling the quote there, but that's basically the idea that kind of, I think that there's a different role for those two groups that you mentioned to play. I think the squad and the left within the Democratic Party have a challenge to offer Biden, as they should have Obama, critical support. That otherwise why be in the same party? But critical, where he's not doing enough, they should call him out, and where he's doing good things, they should back him up. And the whole time they should remember that in some ways his election was quite narrow, 0.7% of the vote in 4 states, and if they'd gone the other way, he would have lost. It was also, in terms of electoral college votes, a very sound victory. In terms of vote share, very sound victory. But Trump was competitive, and so they should, bear in mind. One would want to bear in mind where the opposition is, and that the opposition is this. Has a fascist knocking on the door, actually knocking down the door, and to bear that in mind as they kind of make their choices about what they critique and what they don't. I mean, the moderates in the Democratic Party came out very strong after the election against Black Lives Matter, against defund the police, against many of the things that are associated with the squad. But I think if you look at Georgia as an example, which proves, first of all, that November was no fluke, you see that actually the Democratic Party, which hasn't won an election, has won one election since the Second World War with the white vote alone. So only one election, which was in '64. Democratic Party cannot do without the black vote. Is absolutely core to their prospects. That doesn't mean that they have to bow to BLM or to the squad or whatever, but they have to kind of understand that. And actually, some of the things that Biden certainly rhetorically has been saying more recently suggests that he does understand that. Black Lives Matter, I think, is a different proposition. I think that Black Lives Matter grew under Obama. And then, gained a massive amount of force and traction this year with Trump. And I think that whoever's in power, Black people should have the right to walk down the street without getting shot. I don't think that's an unreasonable demand. And so they have to keep on making the demands that will make that possible. Several hundred insurrectionists invade the Capitol, one person is shot. George Floyd passes a counterfeit 20 at a store and he's murdered. They say that Brown in Ferguson may have stolen cigarillos. And the punishment for stealing cigarillos is apparently summary execution. These people storm the Capitol, take selfies, and they get out alive and they get a trial. So, both the left and Black Lives Matter have their work cut out for them. And both of them proved last year that they are significant, viable forces within that coalition.
Just finally, just a couple things on Britain. When, as we mentioned, talked about Black Lives Matter in the United States. And of course, after the murder of George Floyd, we saw that became very much grew internationally as well, including here in Britain. And you saw on the right in certain publications, this idea of people said, this is importing a problem from the United States. We don't have these sorts of problems here. What's the kind of response to that?
Well, tell that to the large numbers of people in jail, to the large numbers of people the disproportionate number of Black people who were stopped and searched. They said that during COVID when we were dying disproportionately. Tell it to the disproportionate number of young Black people who are kind of on the unemployment line, that the nature of British racism is different, of course. And so America is a more lethal country in general. More people are shot. Suicide is more lethal. Everything is more lethal. And so to the extent that they are saying we don't have that particular kind of expression of racism here, well, notwithstanding Mark Duggan and others, okay. Every country's racism is different. And we are not in a position when we can export anti-racism when we are not practicing it ourselves. And clearly, Windrush being a prime example, that clearly, we are in no position to lecture anybody or to stand aside and say, well, that couldn't happen here. I've not heard in the last few, in the last 10, 20, 30 years of African Americans being deported from America because they couldn't get their paperwork together to prove that they were American in a deliberate ploy to create a hostile environment for migrants. The notion that our racism is better than theirs suggests that there's a good kind of racism, and there isn't.
Finally, it's been over a year now since the Conservatives won an 80-seat majority, and for a lot of people on the left, and partly, let's be honest, whether we like it or not, politics is more generationally based than it's ever been. That's what the polling shows in terms of the allegiances of younger people versus older people, rather than straightforward class politics. It's just a fact. That's what the polling shows. So for a lot of younger people, it feels, that they're living under the consequences of political choices made by those who are not part of their generation. I mean, a lot of people feel pretty despondent. They don't see the way out. They may be pretty fed up with Labour at the moment. What hope is there? What do you think the kind of strategy, or where, in the moment we're locked down, it's hard for political activity in its conventional sense to take place. Where do you think that energy is going to go? I mean, is it just going to dissipate, or do you think it will find a new direction and a new way of organising?
I think it will find a home. I think that is the lesson of the past 20, 30 years, that we're less likely here to have structured movements and more likely to have these moments around which people coalesce and cohere, and that if, however banal this sounds, if we look to someone like Marcus Rashford, then we can see that this government can be shifted, that they can be shamed, and that there's no point in denying this is a pretty bleak time. When you look at the polling on who people blame for the high COVID rates, and they blame other people, not a kind of government that does everything, does too little, too late, constantly, we can see that we have a hell of a battle on our hands. But I am I'm an optimist. I think it's very difficult to be a socialist without an optimist, and I do. When I was born in 1969, it's my birthday on Thursday, by the way. When I was born in 1969, there was no notion in the world that I was born into that the life I have now as a commentator, as a columnist, as a professor would be possible. And so we have to entertain the notion of other possibilities. That King didn't walk up onto the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and say, I have a 10-point plan, or I have an immediate strategy. He had a dream. Now, you can't go on dreaming all the time. Sooner or later, you've got to wake up and you've got to do something. But I believe that Britain is better than this. And I take a lot of hope, actually, from young people who are kind of energetic. And every now and then you see it, like with Black Lives Matter, you see this kind of flourishing and this kind of this emergence of a constituency that you didn't know was there. And so I don't think there's any point in denying that this is a tough moment. I also think it's possible to recognize that it's a tough moment and to look beyond the horizon, if you like, to look over that hill and to say there have been better times ahead that we didn't expect, and there will be more. We have to fight for it, but it's possible.
Gary, thanks for that. I'm sure a lot of people needed that, to be honest. It's good to end on a high. These are discomforting times, particularly for those of a leftish bent. But we really, really appreciate your wisdom, your insight as ever, and happy birthday.
Thank you. Thanks, Owen.
Please support this channel for independent thought, discussion of the most important issues that we face.